I sat by the fire tonight, as I have sat 1,000 nights before, turning over the yellowed pages of notes I gathered across 25 years of silent observation. 500 men, 500 lives. Carnegie, Edison, Ford, Rockefeller, and many whose names the world has since forgotten. I watched them closely, not for the gold they carried in their pockets, but for the gold they carried in their minds. And I tell you now, after all these years, there is only one truth worth engraving on the inner walls of your being. Everything is a game of the mind. First your thoughts change, and only then does your life change. Never the other way around, never. You see, the world has built a great illusion around the question of success. It has whispered to generations of men that wealth is a matter of circumstance, that fortune favors the lucky, that the doors of greatness open only to those born within the right walls. But I have walked among the greatest men of this age, and I have seen something that would shake every ordinary belief. The poor man and the millionaire possessed the same number of hours in a day. They breathed the same air. What separated them was not opportunity. What separated them was the silent conversation they were having with themselves, moment by moment, in the invisible theater of the mind. And here begins the darkest and most thrilling discovery I ever made. Long before a man builds an empire in the outer world, he builds it in the quiet chambers of his imagination. Long before he fails, he rehearses that failure 1,000 times in the shadowy corners of his own mind. You do not become what you want in this life. You become what you believe. And belief is nothing more than a thought repeated until it has taken root in the fertile soil of the subconscious. This is the law that silently governs every fortune ever made and every life ever wasted. I remember the day Mr. Carnegie turned to me with those penetrating eyes of his and asked, in the soft voice of a man who had already conquered his world, whether I would be willing to spend 20 years of my life studying the philosophy of personal achievement without pay. I was a young man then. I had nothing but my hunger and my notebook. And yet in that moment, a decision was formed in my mind that would redirect the entire current of my existence. Mr. Carnegie told me something I have never forgotten. He said that the mind of man is capable of building any bridge it can first imagine. The tragedy of the human race is not that men aim too high and miss. The tragedy is that they aim too low and hit. But the most surprising part comes only now. For years afterward, I studied what actually happens in the mind when a man decides to rise. I watched Edison, a man dismissed by his teachers as a boy too dull to learn. I watched him fail 10,000 times in his quest to build the electric lamp, 10,000 failures, and yet he told me, with that quiet smile of his, that he had not failed 10,000 times. He had simply discovered 10,000 ways that would not work. Do you hear the difference? The circumstances were the same. The materials were the same. What had changed was the silent interpretation occurring behind his eyes. The game of the mind had already been won long before the lamp ever glowed. The man who believes he will fail has already failed, though he may not collapse for another 20 years. The man who believes he will rise has already risen, though the world may not recognize his ascent for another decade. Your thoughts are not harmless guests passing through the house of your being. They are silent architects. They are invisible carpenters. They are laying down the beams and columns of your tomorrow while you sit here tonight, imagining that you are simply thinking. I learned this truth in the hardest way a man can learn anything. I learned it through my own ruin. There was a time long before the world knew my name when I stood at the edge of despair so profound that I could taste it in my own mouth. I had lost my position. I had lost my money. I had, in some quiet and terrible way, lost myself. I remember sitting alone in a small room, staring at the wall, feeling the cold breath of defeat wrap itself around my shoulders. It would have been so easy to accept the verdict of the world, but something stirred in me then, something old and stubborn and alive, and I began to do the one thing I knew how to do. I began to change my thoughts, not my circumstances, not my bank account, not my address, my thoughts. I spoke to myself differently. I commanded my mind, as one commands a disobedient servant, to cease its whispering of ruin and begin its whispering of rebirth. I did this every hour of every day for months, until the soil of my subconscious, long poisoned by fear, began to grow something new. And slowly, so slowly that I could hardly measure the change, my outer world began to shift in accordance with the new conversation taking place inside me. This is not poetry. This is law. This is the most practical and powerful law I have ever encountered in a lifetime of study. Here begins the darkest game of the subconscious mind, for you must understand that the subconscious does not argue. It does not distinguish between what is true and what is false. It does not debate your worthiness. It simply accepts whatever you hand to it again and again, and then sets to work silently, invisibly, relentlessly to arrange the outer world in the image of the inner belief. If you hand it poverty thoughts, it arranges a poverty life. If you hand it prosperity thoughts, it will, in its own time, arrange a prosperity life. The subconscious is not your master. It is your servant, but a servant who takes every word you say with absolute literalness, and therein lies both the danger and the miracle. Modern man, I have come to believe, has lost the compass of his inner purpose, but not the need for it. He walks through his days surrounded by noise, by screens that did not exist in my time, by 100 voices telling him who to be and what to want. He has forgotten the old art of silent reflection. He has forgotten that the mind must be tended like a garden. He believes his thoughts are simply happening to him, as weather happens to a landscape. He does not yet realize that he is the weather. He is the silent cause behind the visible storm of his own life. What Hill said about this subject is deeply unsettling, and I shall say it to you now without decoration. Every man is hypnotized from the moment of his birth by 1,000 suggestions that were never his own. The words of parents who meant well but spoke in fear. The warnings of teachers who confused obedience with wisdom, the endless whispered messages of a society that rewards smallness and punishes the bold dream. By the time a man is 30, he walks through the world wearing invisible chains forged not by enemies, but by his own repeated agreement with the suggestions handed to him. He believes these chains are his character. He believes they are who he is. But I tell you, they are not. They are only what he has been telling himself until he has forgotten that he was the one speaking. And this, my friend, is where the game of the mind begins to turn. For if it is true that a man has been hypnotized into his smallness, then it must also be true that he can be hypnotized into his greatness. If the subconscious has been trained to expect defeat, it can be retrained to expect victory. If the inner voice has been whispering ruin, it can be taught to whisper rebirth. This is not a matter of wishing. This is not a matter of crossing one's fingers and hoping the world shall be kind. This is the most deliberate, the most disciplined, the most sacred work a human being can undertake, the work of rebuilding the temple of one's own mind. I have called this work by many names across the years. I have called it autosuggestion. I have called it the principle of definite purpose. I have called it the silent communion with infinite intelligence. But whatever name we give it, the essence remains unchanged. You are, at every moment of every day, either impressing your subconscious with the image of the life you desire or impressing it with the image of the life you fear. There is no neutral ground. The mind is always building something. The only question is whether you are the architect or the accident. I watched Henry Ford build an empire from this single principle. He held in his mind, with the force of absolute conviction, the image of an automobile that ordinary men could afford. His engineers told him it could not be done. His competitors laughed. His accountants warned him that his dream was mathematical folly. And Ford, with that quiet, stubborn gaze of his, did not argue. He simply returned to his inner image day after day, year after year, and refused to allow any thought into his mind that contradicted the picture he had already built in the silent workshop of his imagination. The outer world eventually surrendered. It always does. Ford did not wait for evidence to believe. He believed first, and the evidence came afterward. This is the reversal the ordinary mind cannot grasp. The ordinary man says, "Show me, and then I shall believe." The master of the mind says, "I believe, and then I shall be shown." It is a complete inversion of the way most men live, and it is the reason most men live ordinary lives while a handful of stubborn dreamers reshape the face of their century. You see, the mind is not a mirror. The mind is a magnet. Whatever image you hold within it, with feeling and with faith, begins to attract the circumstances, the people, the opportunities, the very atoms of the material world that correspond to that image. I know how strange this must sound to the cautious ear, but I have watched it happen too many times in too many lives to call it coincidence. There is a law here, a silent, invisible, and utterly dependable law, and it cares nothing for your skepticism. It simply keeps working, arranging your life according to the dominant thoughts you have fed it. The real turning point begins here. I want you to pause for a moment and consider the conversation you have been having with yourself throughout this day. Not the conversations with your family, not the conversations with your colleagues, the silent, unbroken conversation taking place behind your own eyes. What tone does it carry? What words does it repeat? What images does it paint upon the walls of your imagination? Whatever that conversation has been, that is the blueprint your subconscious has received, and tomorrow shall arrive wearing exactly the shape of the thoughts you fed it today. I once knew a man who had lost everything he owned in the great financial collapse. He came to me in a state of such despair that I feared for his survival. He told me his life was finished, that there was no path forward, that the world had turned against him. I listened to him for a long time, letting him empty the dark contents of his heart into the quiet of my study. When at last he had spoken himself into silence, I told him that he had not been defeated by the collapse. He had been defeated by the story he had begun telling himself about the collapse, and that if he would change the story, even by a single degree, the entire trajectory of his life would begin to bend. He did not believe me at first. Men rarely do. But hunger is a powerful teacher. He began, slowly and awkwardly, to rehearse a new story in the private theater of his mind. He began to speak to himself as if he were already the man he intended to become. He began to feed his subconscious the image of recovery, of strength, of a future rebuilt with his own two hands. Within 18 months, that man had risen to a position greater than the one he had lost. The world had not changed for him. He had changed within himself, and the world had simply rearranged itself to match. This is what I mean by the game of the mind. This is what I mean when I tell you that first your thoughts change, and then your life changes. The sequence cannot be reversed. A man who waits for his life to improve before he improves his thinking shall wait forever. A man who improves his thinking first shall watch in quiet astonishment as his life begins to follow. What the lives of great achievers have been trying to tell us for centuries is this, Carnegie told me in his own way. Edison demonstrated it with every filament. Ford embodied it with every automobile. Rockefeller lived it with every refinery. Lincoln walked it with every defeat he refused to accept as final. These men were not more intelligent than their contemporaries. They were not more gifted. They had simply learned that the mind is the first and final battleground of every human destiny. They won the war there, in the silent chambers of thought, long before the outer world ever recognized their victory. And here I must speak of something that many men fear to confront. The reason most lives do not change is not that the law of the mind has failed. The law never fails. It is working every moment of every day with the precision of the turning of the seasons. The reason most lives do not change is that most men are feeding the law the wrong material. They say they want prosperity, but they think poverty. They say they want health, but they rehearse sickness. They say they want love, but they replay betrayal. And the subconscious, that faithful and literal servant, takes the dominant thought, not the spoken wish, and begins to build accordingly. The mouth says one thing, the mind says another, and the mind always wins. This is the great and terrible honesty of the inner life. You cannot lie to your subconscious. You cannot pretend your way to victory while secretly rehearsing defeat. The feeling behind the thought is the fuel that powers the creation. If the feeling is fear, the creation shall be fearful. If the feeling is faith, the creation shall be abundant. There is no escape from this law, and there is no negotiation with it. But do not despair, my friend, for the same law that has imprisoned so many men in lives they did not choose is the same law that can liberate you, beginning this very night, if you are willing to do the work. The work is not complicated. It is only unfamiliar. You must begin to observe, with the patience of a scientist, the thoughts you permit to pass through the corridors of your mind, not judging them, not fighting them, simply watching, as a gardener watches to see which seeds have been planted in his soil. And when you find a thought that does not serve the life you intend to build, you must gently, firmly, and without drama replace it with a thought that does. You must do this until the new thought has become as natural as the old, and then you must continue because the mind, like a garden, never finishes being tended. This is the practice of autosuggestion. This is the discipline of definite purpose. This is the daily communion with the silent architect who lives within you and builds, from your thoughts, the walls of your tomorrow. But let me warn you of the paradox waiting at the heart of this work. You will not feel at first that anything is changing. The outer world shall remain stubbornly unchanged for days, perhaps weeks, perhaps months. The bills shall still arrive. The problems shall still press. The old voices of doubt shall rise up within you, louder now because they sense they are being dismissed from the throne they have long occupied. And in that silent and unrewarded interval, most men abandon the practice. They return to the old thoughts, as a man returns to a familiar prison, and spend the rest of their days complaining that fortune has overlooked them. Do not be that man. The interval between the changing of the thought and the changing of the life is the most sacred and the most misunderstood period of the entire journey. It is here that the subconscious is doing its invisible work. It is here that the old patterns are dissolving. It is here that the new magnetism is being established. The new circumstances are being drawn toward you. The new doors are being unlocked somewhere far beyond your sight. And if you can hold faith through this interval, if you can believe when every rational voice tells you to quit, you shall emerge on the far side into a life you could scarcely have imagined. This is the true meaning of faith, not a religious sentiment, not a wishful hope, but a stubborn, disciplined, unbreakable refusal to entertain any thought that contradicts the life you have chosen to build. Faith is the state of mind that has been so thoroughly convinced of the outcome that it no longer requires the evidence. And when a mind reaches that state, infinite intelligence itself begins to cooperate with its desires. The universe does not reward the doubter. It rewards the believer. I remember a young man who came to me many years ago, poor in pocket but rich in longing. He wished to become a writer, though he had no credentials, no publications. He had only a burning desire and a stubborn faith in his own unspoken gift. I told him to begin that very night to impress upon his subconscious the image of himself as a successful writer, not to wait for any external validation, to simply begin, in the silent theater of his imagination, to live as if the outcome were already accomplished. He looked at me as if I had lost my senses, but desperation is sometimes the beginning of wisdom. He practiced for 3 years with no visible reward, and then in the 4th year, the doors began to open. First one small publication, then another, then a correspondence with an editor, then a contract. The life he had been rehearsing in his mind became the life he was living in the world. The inner picture had become the outer fact, as it always must when a man refuses to abandon it. When was the last time, my friend, that you allowed yourself to hold such a picture? When did you last sit in silence and deliberately paint upon the walls of your imagination the image of the life you were meant to live? Not the life others have chosen for you, not the life circumstance has handed you, the life that whispers to you in the quiet hours, in the moments before sleep, in the sudden unguarded instants when you remember who you were before the world taught you to forget. That whisper is not nothing. That whisper is the voice of your definite purpose, calling to you from the deep well of your own being. It is the seed of every great achievement you were placed upon this earth to accomplish. And the only reason it has not yet become your life is that you have not yet given it the one thing it requires in order to grow: your faith, your focus, your unwavering inner agreement that this and not the other shall be the story of your days. Everything is a game of the mind. I said it at the beginning, and I shall say it again now at the end, because truth deserves repetition. First, your thoughts change, and then your life changes. There is no other sequence. The men who built the American century did not wait for better conditions. They built better conditions by first building better thoughts. The men who rose from poverty to wealth did not stumble upon a fortune. They became, in the silent chambers of their minds, the kind of men to whom fortune could be given, and the same law that served them shall serve you the moment you decide to take up the game in earnest. So I ask you tonight, as you sit wherever you sit and listen to these words, to consider a single question. I ask you not to answer it quickly. Sit with it, perhaps for many days, until it has done its slow and quiet work upon you. What thought, if you held it with unbreakable faith from this night forward, would begin to rewrite the entire story of your life? Find that thought, feed it, guard it, repeat it to yourself in the morning and in the evening, in the marketplace and in the solitude of your own chamber. Do not share it with those who would mock it. Do not expose it to the cold winds of other men's doubt. Hold it as a gardener holds a seed in the warm, dark soil of your own conviction, and water it with the daily discipline of your belief. Do this for 1 month. Do this for 6 months. Do this for a year, if that is what it requires. And then watch with quiet astonishment as the outer world begins to arrange itself around the inner truth you have so patiently cultivated. For this is the game of the mind. This is the secret law that governs every rising and every falling fortune on this earth. And this is the invitation that has been waiting for you, perhaps for many years, perhaps for your entire life, to pick up the pen that you alone hold and begin to write the story that only you can write. The question now is not whether the law works. The law has always worked. The question is whether you shall begin tonight to work the law. I shall leave you here at the threshold of that decision as I was once left at the threshold of my own. The fire burns low, the notebooks are closed, the hour is late, but somewhere within you, if you listen carefully, a voice is beginning to stir. It is the voice of the man or the woman you were meant to become, calling to you across the distance of the life you have lived so far. It asks you only one thing. It asks you to change tonight a single thought, and to trust that from that single changed thought, the whole of your tomorrow shall slowly, surely, and magnificently begin to rise. Everything, my friend, is a game of the mind. First, your thoughts change, then your life changes. It was never the other way around, and it shall never be. The fire has not yet gone out. The story has only just begun. When the voice of your own definite purpose speaks again, in the quiet hour between sleeping and waking, shall you this time finally listen?